Stalin moved an entire country 200 kilometers west, and this is not the normal thing to do to an ally. When people ask me why Poland cannot stand Russia, the answer lies in this unprecedented act of geographical violence that displaced millions of people and redrew the map of Europe through mass deportation and ethnic cleansing. What happened to Poland reveals everything about how Russia treats its neighbors, even those supposedly fighting on the same side. This isn't just historical trivia. It's the foundation of modern Eastern European politics and explains why countries will do anything to avoid falling under Russian influence again. The story begins at Yalta in 1945, where Stalin made demands that shocked even his wartime allies. Roosevelt and Churchill thought they were negotiating the post-war settlement of Europe, but Stalin was implementing a master plan for continental domination that would reshape the entire region according to Russian imperial interests. His demand was simple but audacious. Move Poland's borders 200 kilometers westward, giving vast Polish territories to the Soviet Union while compensating Poland with German lands in the west. When his allies objected that you cannot simply relocate an entire nation, Stalin's response was characteristically blunt. The Red Army was already there, so the Red Army would decide. This wasn't negotiation. It was dictation backed by overwhelming military force and the implicit threat that anyone who resisted would share the fate of the millions of Eastern Europeans who had already died under Soviet occupation. What followed was one of the largest forced population movements in human history, orchestrated with the same methodical brutality that characterized all Soviet policies towards subject peoples. Stalin didn't just want to redraw borders on maps. He wanted to fundamentally alter the demographic composition of Eastern Europe to prevent future resistance to Soviet control. The goal was to create ethnically homogeneous states where no minority populations could serve as focal points for independence movements or sources of divided loyalty. This required moving millions of Germans, Poles, and Ukrainians from their ancestral homes and dumping them in territories where they had no historical connections or local support networks. The human cost was staggering and deliberately ignored by Soviet planners who viewed people as interchangeable units to be moved around like pieces on a chessboard. Millions of refugees were forced to relocate across a war-devastated continent where there was no infrastructure to support them, no housing to shelter them, and no economic opportunities to sustain them. Many died during the forced marches. Many more died from exposure and starvation in the overcrowded refugee camps, and countless others died from diseases that spread rapidly through displaced populations living in unsanitary conditions. For the first time in their histories, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Ukraine became ethnically homogeneous states. But this homogeneity was achieved through systematic ethnic cleansing rather than natural demographic evolution. The Poles who found themselves in what had been German territory were not settlers choosing to relocate. They were refugees driven from their ancestral lands in what had become Soviet Ukraine and Belarus. The Germans who had lived in these territories for generations were expelled en masse, regardless of their personal politics or wartime behavior. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were obliterated in a matter of months, their cultural heritage destroyed along with their physical presence. Stalin's justification for this massive population transfer was typically cynical. He claimed it would prevent future ethnic conflicts by ensuring that each nation lived within its own ethnically pure borders. But the real purpose was to eliminate any cross-border ethnic connections that might complicate Soviet control or provide alternative sources of identity and loyalty. By forcing Poles to live only in Poland, Germans only in Germany, and Ukrainians only in Ukraine, Stalin hoped to create isolated nation-states that would be easier to control and less likely to form troublesome alliances based on shared ethnic or religious identities. The Polish case reveals the true nature of this policy because Poland was supposedly an ally that had suffered terribly under Nazi occupation and deserved Soviet protection and assistance. Instead, Poland became the testing ground for techniques of demographic engineering that would later be applied throughout the Soviet sphere of influence. Polish territories in the east, including the historically significant cities of Lviv and Vilnius, were simply annexed to the Soviet Union and their Polish populations expelled or eliminated. Polish culture was systematically suppressed in these regions. Polish place names were changed to Russian or Ukrainian equivalents, and Polish historical monuments were destroyed or repurposed to serve Soviet propaganda narratives. Meanwhile, the Poles who were relocated to formerly German territories in the West faced the enormous challenge of building new lives in areas where everything from the architecture to the agricultural techniques reflected a completely different cultural tradition. They were expected to be grateful for this compensation, even though it meant abandoning everything their families had built over generations and starting over as strangers in a strange land. The psychological trauma of this displacement lasted for generations and created deep resentments that continue to influence Polish politics and foreign policy today. What makes this even more horrific is that Stalin required Polish and Hungarian troops to help maintain some of these territorial gains through military force. Poland and Hungary, countries that had themselves been victimized by Soviet territorial demands, were expected to provide soldiers to help Moscow control other conquered territories. This was psychological warfare as much as geographical redistribution, forcing victims to become complicit in the victimization of others, thereby making resistance more difficult and collaboration more psychologically acceptable. The message was clear: resistance is futile, so you might as well benefit from helping us dominate your neighbors. The broader pattern reveals how continental empires maintain control through systematic divide and rule strategies that prevent subject peoples from forming effective coalitions against imperial control. V. By giving Poland some German territory while taking away Polish territory in the east, Stalin ensured that Poland could never return to its pre-war borders without challenging Soviet control. By making Poland complicit in the displacement of Germans, he created guilt and resentment that complicated Poland's relationships with potential Western allies who might otherwise have supported Polish independence. Every territorial arrangement was designed to create multiple sources of conflict and dependency that would keep subject states focused on local grievances rather than broader challenges to Soviet hegemony. This territorial reshuffling reveals the extractive nature of Soviet thinking. The regions Stalin annexed from Poland were rich in resources and agricultural land, while territories Poland received had been devastated by war and stripped of industrial assets. Poland was supposed to be grateful for bombed-out cities and depleted farmland in exchange for losing productive and culturally significant parts of their homeland. This was typical Soviet logic: take the best assets for Moscow while giving subject states responsibility for rebuilding damaged areas with minimal resources. The demographic engineering also served long-term strategic purposes. By eliminating ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, Stalin removed a population that might have bridged Eastern and Western Europe or justified future German intervention. By forcing Poles into historically German territories, he created a situation where Poland would need Soviet protection against German attempts to reclaim these areas. Every population movement increased Soviet advantages while reducing options for rivals. What happened to Poland wasn't unique. Similar patterns were implemented throughout the Soviet sphere. But Poland's case is particularly important because it demonstrates how these policies affected even countries that were officially allies rather than conquered enemies. If this was how Stalin treated Poland, which had fought alongside the Allies, imagine what he was prepared to do to countries that had opposed Soviet interests. The Polish experience became a template for Soviet policy and a warning about what Soviet friendship entailed. The long-term consequences of this geographic violence continue to shape European politics today. Poland's desperate desire to join NATO and integrate with Western institutions reflects not just fear of current Russian aggression, but memory of historical Russian betrayal and brutality. When Polish leaders look at Ukraine today, they see their own historical experience playing out again: a supposedly allied country being dismembered by Russian imperial ambitions, and its population subjected to forced displacement and cultural destruction. This is why Poland has been one of Ukraine's strongest supporters, and why Polish warnings about Russian intentions carry special weight in Western capitals. Understanding the Polish case helps explain why Eastern Europeans resist Western suggestions that they should accommodate Russian security concerns. They know from experience what Russian accommodation means: complete subordination disguised as partnership, territorial dismemberment presented as border adjustment, demographic destruction justified as conflict prevention. The scars run too deep for Eastern Europeans to trust arrangements giving Russia veto power over their policies. The lesson for contemporary policymakers is that Russian imperial thinking hasn't changed since Stalin's time, only methods have been updated. The desire to control neighboring territories and reshape demographic patterns to serve Russian interests remains constant. What happened to Poland in 1945 provides a roadmap for understanding what Russia wants to do in Ukraine today.